The briefing room fell silent as Commander Sarah Chen watched her tactical diagrams spread across Lieutenant Morrison's desk. Her months of careful planning, her breakthrough strategy that could save dozens of lives, now bearing his signature. The other male officers nodded approvingly at his brilliant work while Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, her hands trembling with rage and disbelief. They had stolen everything. Her career, her reputation, her future, all of it ripped away in one calculated move. But 18 months later, Sarah stood before the same officers, now wearing the insignia of a decorated mission leader. The room buzzed with tension as she opened the classified folder that would change everything. Her voice steady, her evidence undeniable. She was about to speak the words that would expose them all. What country are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. And if these stories inspire you, please subscribe for more. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the cramped military planning room as Captain Sarah Chen spread her tactical maps across the metal table. It was 2:47 a.m., and the base was nearly empty except for the skeleton crew manning the night shift. Sarah had been working for 6 straight months on Operation Sandstorm, a complex rescue mission that would extract 12 captured intelligence officers from behind enemy lines in the Syrian desert. Every line on those maps represented hours of satellite analysis, weather pattern studies, and risk calculations. Every arrow showed troop movements she had choreographed like a deadly ballet. The operation was her masterpiece, a surgical strike that would minimize casualties while maximizing the chances of bringing everyone home alive. Sarah rubbed her tired eyes and reached for her cold coffee. Tomorrow morning, she would present the plan to Colonel Davidson and the senior staff. After years of being overlooked for promotion, passed over for leadership roles, and having her ideas dismissed in favor of more traditional approaches from her male colleagues, this was her moment. Operation Sandstorm would prove she belonged at the decision-making table. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. While conventional wisdom suggested a full frontal assault with overwhelming force, Sarah had identified a narrow window of opportunity. Intelligence showed that the enemy rotated their guards every 72 hours, and there was a 40-minute gap in their perimeter surveillance due to a blind spot created by 2 overlapping patrol routes. Her team could infiltrate during this window, extract the hostages, and be gone before anyone realized what had happened. She had spent weeks studying the terrain, calculating wind patterns that would affect helicopter extraction, and identifying 3 separate escape routes in case the primary plan failed. The beauty of her strategy lay in its layers, each contingency built upon the last, creating a web of possibilities that could adapt to changing circumstances on the ground. Sarah rolled up the maps and locked them in her secure filing cabinet. In 6 hours, she would change the trajectory of her military career forever. But when she walked into the briefing room that Tuesday morning, her world collapsed. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison stood at the front of the room, her tactical maps projected onto the wall behind him. Every detail was there: her troop movements, her timing calculations, her carefully plotted escape routes. Even her notes about the weather patterns were transcribed word for word. The only difference was the signature in the bottom right corner, which now read Lieutenant. Column J. Morrison instead of Captain. Saint Chen. Gentlemen, Morrison was saying to the assembled senior staff, I believe Operation Sandstorm represents our best chance of bringing our people home safely. Sarah's briefcase slipped from her numb fingers, hitting the floor with a metallic crash that echoed through the room. Every head turned toward her, but Morrison's expression remained impassive, almost bored. Ah, Captain Chen, Colonel Davidson said without looking up from the documents. Perfect timing. We were just reviewing Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's excellent work on the rescue operation. The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Her throat constricted, making it impossible to speak. Around the table, the faces of men she had worked alongside for years showed nothing but polite attention. Major Richards, who had seen her staying late every night for weeks. Captain Walsh, who had helped her access the satellite imaging systems. None of them met her eyes. Sir? Sarah finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Those are my— Your what, Captain? Morrison's voice cut through her words like a blade. I'm sorry, but I'm not sure what you're referring to. The room fell into uncomfortable silence. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She looked around the table, searching for any sign of support, any acknowledgement of what was happening. Instead, she saw carefully neutral expressions and downcast eyes. The tactical plans, she said, her voice growing stronger despite the trembling in her hands. "I've been working on Operation Sandstorm for 6 months. Those are my maps, my calculations, my—" "Captain Chen," Colonel Davidson's voice carried a warning tone. "I think you're confused. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison has been developing this operation for the past several weeks. Unless you have documentation proving otherwise?" Sarah's mind raced. All of her preliminary notes were in her personal files, but the finished plans, the ones that mattered, had been stored in the shared military database where Morrison had clearance to access them. In the collaborative environment of military planning, it would be nearly impossible to prove authorship after the fact. "I have my research files," she said desperately. "My preliminary sketches, my weather analysis. Research and support work is valuable," Morrison said with a patronizing smile. "I'm sure your contributions to the intelligence gathering phase were helpful." The implication was clear. She had been relegated to a subordinate role in her own operation, reduced to a research assistant who had merely provided background information for Morrison's brilliant plan. Sarah stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, watching her career implode. The men around the table shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. No one defended her. The silence stretched until Colonel Davidson cleared his throat. "Well then," he said, shuffling the papers. "Excellent work, Morrison. We'll move forward with your plan immediately. Captain Chen, thank you for your support work." Sarah left the briefing room in a daze, her legs carrying her through the corridors without conscious direction. She found herself in the women's restroom, gripping the cold porcelain sink as her reflection stared back from the mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock and rage. The next few weeks passed in a blur of humiliation and isolation. Operation Sandstorm was approved for immediate implementation, with Morrison designated as mission commander. Sarah watched from the sidelines as her plan was executed flawlessly, bringing all 12 hostages home without a single casualty. The mission was hailed as a triumph of strategic thinking and careful planning. Morrison was promoted to full colonel within a month. He gave interviews to military publications about his innovative approach to rescue operations. Sarah's name was never mentioned. But the worst part wasn't the lack of recognition. It was the way her colleagues treated her afterward. Word had somehow spread that she had tried to claim credit for Morrison's work. Conversation stopped when she entered rooms. Other officers avoided making eye contact. She was branded as someone who couldn't be trusted, someone who would try to steal glory from her superiors. Captain Walsh, who had once been friendly, now spoke to her in clipped professional tones. Major Richards avoided her entirely. Even the junior officers seemed uncomfortable around her, as if her perceived dishonesty might be contagious. Sarah threw herself into her work, staying late every night and volunteering for the most difficult assignments. She thought that if she could just prove her worth through sheer effort, the whispers would stop. Instead, her dedication was seen as desperation, further evidence of someone trying too hard to make up for past transgressions. 6 months after Operation Sandstorm, Sarah requested a transfer to a different unit. She couldn't stand the constant feeling of being watched and judged. Colonel Davidson approved the transfer with what seemed like relief, probably glad to be rid of a troublemaker. Her new assignment was to a training facility in Nevada, far from any actual operations. It was clearly a dead-end posting, the kind of place where military careers went to die quietly. Sarah spent her days teaching basic tactical principles to new recruits, watching younger officers advance past her while she remained frozen in rank. The desert heat was brutal, but it matched the burning anger that had taken up permanent residence in her chest. Every morning, she woke up thinking about Morrison and the others who had sat silently while her life's work was stolen. Every night, she fell asleep plotting impossible revenge scenarios that would never come to pass. But slowly, something began to change. Working with the recruits reminded Sarah why she had joined the military in the first place. These young men and women looked at her with respect and admiration, unaware of the supposed scandal that had followed her from her previous posting. They saw only a knowledgeable instructor who pushed them to be their best. One of her students, Lieutenant Maria Santos, showed particular promise in tactical planning. Sarah found herself staying after hours to work with Santos on complex scenarios, sharing techniques she had developed over years of study and experience. It felt good to teach, to pass on knowledge without the constant political maneuvering of higher command. "Ma'am," Santos said one evening as they finished reviewing a particularly challenging exercise. "I've learned more from you in 3 months than I did in 2 years at the academy. Have you ever considered writing a tactical manual?" Sarah was touched by the comment, but it also reminded her of everything she had lost. "I don't think anyone would be interested in my theories," she said quietly. "Are you kidding?" Santos looked genuinely surprised. "The exercises you design are incredible. Yesterday's urban warfare scenario was the most realistic thing I've ever seen. Where did you learn to think like that?" For a moment, Sarah considered telling Santos about Operation Sandstorm, about the plan that had been stolen and the career that had been destroyed, but she caught herself. What was the point? It would only sound like the bitter complaints of someone who couldn't let go of the past. "Experience," she said simply, "and a lot of late nights studying maps." But Santos had planted a seed. That night, Sarah began working on a comprehensive tactical manual, not for recognition or advancement, but because the ideas in her head demanded to be written down. She found herself energized in a way she hadn't felt since before the Morrison incident, working late into the night on theories and strategies that built upon everything she had learned. The manual grew from a few pages of basic principles to a detailed exploration of unconventional warfare tactics. Sarah wrote about the importance of adaptability, about finding opportunities in seemingly impossible situations, about the psychological aspects of combat leadership. She wrote about everything she had learned and everything she wished she could have taught her former colleagues. 18 months into her assignment in Nevada, Sarah received an unexpected call. It was General Patricia Hayes, one of the few women to reach the upper echelons of military command. Sarah had never met the general, but her reputation was legendary, a brilliant strategist who had broken through barriers that had seemed insurmountable. "Captain Chen," General Hayes said, her voice crisp and professional. "I understand you've been working on a tactical manual." Sarah's heart sank. Had she somehow violated regulations by writing without permission? "Yes, ma'am. It's just a personal project not intended for—" "I'd like to see it," the general interrupted. "I'll be visiting your facility next week for an inspection. Make sure you have a copy ready." The call ended before Sarah could respond. She spent the next week polishing her manual, terrified that she was about to face another career-ending humiliation. The night before General Hayes' arrival, she barely slept, running through every possible scenario in her mind. The inspection went smoothly until the afternoon, when General Hayes requested a private meeting with Sarah. They sat in the small office Sarah had been assigned, the tactical manual sitting on the desk between them like a piece of evidence at a trial. General Hayes picked up the manual and flipped through it slowly, her expression unreadable. Sarah sat rigidly at attention, waiting for the criticism that was sure to come. "This is remarkable work," the general said finally, looking up from the pages. "Your analysis of asymmetric warfare is particularly insightful. Where did you develop these theories?" Sarah hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Field experience and personal study, ma'am." "I see." General Hayes leaned back in her chair, studying Sarah with intense dark eyes. "Tell me about Operation Sandstorm." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her carefully maintained composure cracked, and she felt heat rushing to her face. "Ma'am, I know what happened," General Hayes said quietly. "I know whose plan it really was." Sarah stared at the general, afraid to hope, afraid to believe what she was hearing. "Ma'am? I've been investigating irregularities in mission planning procedures," General Hayes continued. "It seems that Lieutenant Colonel Morrison has a pattern of appropriating other officers' work. Operation Sandstorm wasn't the first time." The room seemed to spin around Sarah. For over a year, she had carried the weight of injustice, believing that the truth would never come to light. Now, facing this powerful woman who somehow knew what had really happened, she felt emotions she had buried threatening to overwhelm her. "Why?" Sarah managed to ask. "Why are you telling me this?" General Hayes smiled for the first time since entering the room. "Because I have a job for you. We're planning a complex operation that requires exactly the kind of innovative thinking demonstrated in your manual. More importantly, it requires someone who can't be bought, corrupted, or intimidated. Someone with integrity." "What kind of operation?" "The kind that will expose Morrison and his accomplices," General Hayes said. "The kind that will ensure this never happens to another officer again." Sarah felt something inside her chest, something that had been locked away for months, begin to unfold. It wasn't just hope, it was purpose. "What would you need me to do?" "Lead it," General Hayes said simply. I'm offering you a promotion to major and command of a specialized task force. Your mission will be to investigate and document patterns of misconduct among senior officers, starting with Morrison's unit. The offer was everything Sarah had dreamed of and more, but with it came a sobering realization of what she would be taking on. Going after Morrison and his allies would make powerful enemies. It would be dangerous professionally and personally. "Ma'am," Sarah said carefully, "if I accept this assignment, I need to know that you'll support me when the pushback comes." "Because it will come." General Hayes nodded approvingly. "I wouldn't have made the offer if I wasn't prepared to see it through. You'll have my full backing and direct access to report to me personally. No intermediaries, no chain of command that can be compromised." Sarah looked down at her tactical manual, thinking about all the nights she had spent writing by the light of her desk lamp, pouring her knowledge and experience onto the pages. She had written it never expecting anyone to read it, never imagining it would lead to this moment. "When do I start?" she asked. The next 3 months were a whirlwind of preparation and investigation. Sarah's new task force was small but elite, 5 carefully selected officers with impeccable records and unquestioned loyalty. They worked out of a secure facility in Virginia, far from the political machinations of the Pentagon. The investigation into Morrison's activities revealed a pattern of theft and manipulation that went back years. He had built his career on the stolen work of subordinates, particularly female officers who were less likely to be believed if they complained. The evidence was damning, but Sarah knew that gathering proof and making charges stick were 2 very different things. Morrison had powerful allies, men who had benefited from his rise through the ranks. Taking him down would require more than just documentation. It would require catching him in the act, creating a situation where denial was impossible. Sarah spent sleepless nights planning the operation that would expose Morrison and his network. It had to be perfect, airtight, with no room for interpretation or plausible deniability. She drew on everything she had learned from Operation Sandstorm, but this time the stakes were different. This time, she wasn't just trying to save hostages, she was trying to save the integrity of the institution she had devoted her life to serving. The breakthrough came when one of Morrison's former subordinates, Captain Jennifer Walsh, agreed to cooperate with the investigation. Walsh had been present during several instances of theft and had remained silent out of fear for her career. Now, facing early retirement after being passed over for promotion yet again, she was ready to tell the truth. He made it clear that anyone who opposed him would be destroyed. Walsh told Sarah during a recorded interview, "Look what happened to you after Operation Sandstorm. You became a cautionary tale, proof of what would happen to anyone who tried to challenge him." With Walsh's testimony and other evidence they had gathered, Sarah felt ready to move forward. But General Hayes had one more requirement. "I want you to give Morrison enough rope to hang himself," the general said during one of their weekly briefings. "Set up a situation where he'll steal from you again, but this time we'll be watching." Sarah's pulse quickened. The idea of deliberately putting herself in Morrison's path again was terrifying, but it was also exactly the kind of poetic justice she had dreamed about during her darkest moments in Nevada. "What did you have in mind?" she asked. "Create a new tactical plan," General Hayes said. "Something brilliant, something he won't be able to resist claiming as his own. But this time, we'll have multiple witnesses and documentation proving it's your work." Sarah began developing what she would later call Operation Mirror, a complex anti-terrorism strategy that combined elements of psychological warfare with precision strikes. She worked openly, making sure that Morrison would learn about the plan through unofficial channels. She knew his ego wouldn't allow him to pass up the opportunity to claim credit for such an innovative strategy. The plan was a masterpiece, building on everything Sarah had learned about unconventional warfare. It called for a coordinated campaign that would dismantle terrorist networks by turning their own propaganda against them, using carefully crafted disinformation to create internal conflicts within their organizations. Sarah made sure to leave copies of her preliminary work where Morrison's allies could access them. She scheduled meetings that Morrison might overhear, dropped hints about the revolutionary new approach she was developing. It was like baiting a trap, and she knew that Morrison's arrogance would make him unable to resist. The trap was sprung 3 weeks later. Sarah was called to a briefing at the Pentagon, ostensibly to present her work on counter-terrorism strategy. But when she arrived, she found Morrison standing at the front of the room, her Operation Mirror documents spread across the presentation table. This time, however, things were different. This time, Sarah was ready. "Gentlemen," Morrison was saying to the assembled officers, "I believe my new anti-terrorism strategy represents a paradigm shift in how we approach asymmetric warfare." Sarah entered the room carrying a briefcase filled with documented evidence of her work on Operation Mirror. Hidden in her jacket was a small recording device, and she knew that similar devices were being operated by General Hayes and other members of her task force who had been positioned throughout the room. "Lieutenant Colonel Morrison," Sarah said, her voice clear and confident, "before you continue, I think there's something the committee should know about the origins of that strategy." Morrison's face went pale, but he quickly recovered his composure. "Captain Chen, I'm not sure what you're implying, but—" "I'm not implying anything," Sarah interrupted, opening her briefcase and removing a thick folder. "I'm stating facts. Operation Mirror is my work, developed over the past 6 weeks as part of a special assignment from General Hayes." The room erupted in murmurs and shifting chairs. Morrison's eyes darted around the table, looking for support from his usual allies. But this time, their expressions were different. This time, they looked worried. General Hayes stood up from her position at the back of the room. "Gentlemen, I think it's time we had a frank discussion about intellectual property theft within our ranks." What followed was the most satisfying hour of Sarah's military career. One by one, the evidence was presented. Walsh's testimony was played on a recording device. Documents were distributed showing the timeline of Sarah's work on Operation Mirror, complete with timestamps and witness signatures. Other victims of Morrison's theft came forward, their stories corroborating a pattern of misconduct that could no longer be denied. Morrison tried to defend himself, claiming that he had developed the strategy independently, that any similarities to Sarah's work were purely coincidental. But the evidence was overwhelming, and his explanations became increasingly desperate and incoherent. The final blow came when General Hayes revealed that Morrison's computer had been under surveillance for the past month as part of the investigation. They had records of him accessing Sarah's files, downloading her documents, and even editing them to replace her name with his own. "Colonel Morrison," General Hayes said, her voice cutting through his protests, "you are hereby relieved of duty pending a full investigation into these charges. You will surrender your security clearance and report to the military police for processing." Sarah watched as 2 MPs entered the room and escorted Morrison out. The man who had stolen her life's work, who had destroyed her reputation and driven her into exile, was led away in handcuffs. The room fell silent as the door closed behind them. "Major Chen," General Hayes said, using Sarah's new rank for the first time in public, "would you like to complete your presentation of Operation Mirror?" Sarah looked around the room at the faces of officers who had once dismissed her, who had sat silently while her work was stolen, who had whispered about her supposed dishonesty. Now they watched her with expressions ranging from shame to admiration, waiting to hear what she had to say. "Gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice steady and strong, "Operation Mirror represents more than just a new approach to counterterrorism. It represents a commitment to integrity, to ensuring that credit goes where credit is due, and to creating an environment where the best ideas can flourish regardless of who develops them." The presentation that followed was flawless. Sarah outlined her strategy with the confidence of someone who knew every detail intimately, who had lived with these ideas for weeks and could defend every assumption and calculation. The questions that came afterward were respectful, even deferential. These officers had just witnessed the downfall of a man they had thought untouchable, and they weren't about to risk being associated with his misconduct. Operation Mirror was approved unanimously, and Sarah was assigned to lead its implementation. More importantly, she was promoted to lieutenant colonel and given command of a new unit dedicated to developing innovative military strategies. In the months that followed, Morrison's network of accomplices was systematically exposed and prosecuted. Several senior officers were forced into early retirement, while others faced court-martial proceedings. Captain Walsh was promoted and assigned to Sarah's new unit, finally receiving the recognition her abilities deserved. The investigation also led to broader reforms in how military planning was conducted. New protocols were established to ensure proper attribution of intellectual property, and channels were created for officers to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. Sarah's tactical manual was officially published by the Department of Defense and became required reading at military academies around the world. She began receiving invitations to speak at conferences and universities, sharing her expertise with a new generation of military leaders. But the most meaningful moment came 6 months later, when Sarah received a letter from Lieutenant Santos, her former student from Nevada. Santos had been assigned to a combat unit and was writing to thank Sarah for the training that had helped her lead her team through a difficult mission. "Ma'am," the letter read, "I wanted you to know that the tactical principles you taught me saved lives last week. When our unit came under fire during a reconnaissance mission, I remembered what you said about finding opportunities in impossible situations. We were outnumbered 3-1, but I used the terrain analysis techniques you showed me to find an escape route that the enemy hadn't anticipated. All 12 members of my team made it home safely." Sarah read the letter 3 times, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with recognition or revenge. This was what military service was supposed to be about: protecting people, making a difference, passing on knowledge that could save lives. She thought about Morrison, who was facing a court-martial and the end of his career. Part of her felt vindicated by his downfall, but mostly she felt sad for the waste of it all. If he had channeled his ambition into developing his own ideas instead of stealing from others, he might have made genuine contributions to military strategy. Instead, he had chosen a path that ultimately led to his own destruction. Sarah kept Santos's letter framed on her desk as a reminder of why she had fought so hard to reclaim her career. It wasn't about personal glory or getting revenge on those who had wronged her. It was about ensuring that good ideas could flourish, that talented officers could contribute to their fullest potential, and that the military could continue to evolve and improve. 2 years after her confrontation with Morrison, Sarah was promoted to colonel and offered a position at the Pentagon developing strategy for emerging threats. As she cleaned out her office, preparing for the move to Washington, she found her old tactical manual, the one she had written during those lonely nights in Nevada. The pages were worn now, marked with notes and corrections from countless revisions. It represented hundreds of hours of work, years of accumulated knowledge, and a faith in the power of ideas that had sustained her through the darkest period of her career. Sarah smiled as she packed the manual into her briefcase. Tomorrow, she would begin a new chapter of her military service, working at the highest levels of strategic planning. She would have opportunities to shape policy, to influence the direction of military thinking, and to ensure that the next generation of officers had the tools they needed to succeed. But she would also remember the lessons of Operation Sandstorm and Operation Mirror. She would remember that integrity matters more than advancement, that the truth has a way of emerging even when it seems buried forever, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not against external enemies, but against the corruption and dishonesty that can poison an institution from within. As Sarah walked out of her office for the last time, she thought about all the young officers like Santos who were serving in units around the world. Some of them were undoubtedly facing the same challenges she had faced: discrimination, theft of their ideas, pressure to remain silent in the face of injustice. She hoped that her story would reach them, that they would know they weren't alone, and that they would have the courage to keep fighting for what was right. Because in the end, that was what military service was really about. Not just defending the country from external threats, but defending the values and principles that made the country worth defending in the first place. The sun was setting as Sarah drove away from the base, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and gold. Behind her lay the place where she had rebuilt her career and rediscovered her purpose. Ahead lay new challenges and opportunities, the chance to make a difference on an even larger scale. She thought about Morrison one last time, wondering if he understood now what he had lost when he chose to steal instead of create. She thought about the officers who had remained silent when they should have spoken up, and whether they had learned anything from watching his downfall. But mostly, she thought about the future, about the strategies she would develop, the officers she would mentor, and the lives that might be saved by the ideas that were still taking shape in her mind. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but Sarah faced it with confidence earned through trial and vindication. The girl who had once stood frozen in a briefing room, watching her life's work being stolen, was gone. In her place was a woman who had learned that justice delayed is not always justice denied, that integrity is its own reward, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon in any arsenal is simply refusing to give up. As the lights of the base faded in her rearview mirror, Sarah began mentally outlining her next tactical manual. This one would be about leadership in crisis, about maintaining ethical standards under pressure, and about the courage required to stand up for what's right even when it seems hopeless. She had a feeling it was going to be her best work yet.